Doha, March 2025, 6:47 in the morning. The city is waking up the way it always does. Coffee shops opening their doors. The morning call to prayer fading into the Gulf breeze. Businessmen in pressed suits checking their phones in hotel lobbies. Children heading to school. Everything looks exactly the way it looked yesterday. But at 6:47 in the morning, inside a building most people will never see, a document is being finalized. No press conference. No announcement. No breaking news ticker running across your screen. Just a quiet, formal, diplomatic statement being prepared for transmission to Washington. And with that single document, the last functioning communication channel between the United States and Iran, the only architecture that stood between this conflict and complete, unmanageable escalation, is being permanently dismantled. Not by a missile, not by a military operation, by a letter. Qatar is done. The question nobody in Washington appears to be asking, the question that should terrify anyone paying serious attention, is devastatingly simple. When the last mediator walks away from the table, who is left to stop what comes next? That is what we are going to answer today. Before we go further, let me tell you exactly what you are going to walk away with after watching this video. First, why Qatar's withdrawal is not a diplomatic footnote. It is a structural indictment of how this conflict has been conducted from the beginning. Second, the domino mechanism that is quietly pulling every significant Arab state away from Washington's coalition, one by one, faster than anyone is publicly acknowledging. Third, the asymmetric counterattack being prepared right now, not with missiles, with choke points. Economic, legal, and logistical pressure points that no amount of air superiority can neutralize. And fourth, 3 specific scenarios for where this goes next, and which one the smart money is quietly, very quietly, betting on. Everything in this region is moving faster than the headlines can keep up with. If you are not subscribed to this channel yet, do it right now. Turn on notifications, because when the next move happens, you will want to already be here. Here is what the mainstream narrative wants you to believe. Qatar stepped back from a complicated mediation role. A small Gulf state made a pragmatic diplomatic adjustment. Washington still holds the strategic initiative. The pressure campaign is working. Iran is isolated, economically strangled, and militarily outmatched. The coalition holds. That is the official version. Clean, confident, completely disconnected from what is actually happening on the ground. Let us start with the illusion. Washington has been operating on a strategic assumption that has not been seriously questioned inside the Beltway in over 2 decades. The assumption is this: American military and economic superiority is so overwhelming that the rules of engagement, the actual rules, the unwritten ones, apply differently to the United States than they do to everyone else. You can invite a delegation to negotiate and bomb them while they are traveling. You can shake hands on a framework in the morning and launch strikes by the following dawn. You can use the infrastructure of diplomacy as a targeting mechanism, and the system will absorb it. The mediators will stay. The coalition will hold. The pressure will work. That assumption was not irrational. It was built on evidence. It worked in Iraq. It worked in Libya. It worked across a long sequence of engagements where American power was so asymmetric that the other side had no viable response and the facilitating parties had no viable exit. But here's what Washington failed to account for. Every government watching those episodes drew its own conclusions. They studied the pattern. They mapped it. And they updated their calculations accordingly. The playbook that worked when the audience did not understand the game stops working the moment the audience memorizes every move. Qatar understood the game. They participated anyway, once, twice, absorbing costs that would have ended any other country's involvement immediately. Qatari diplomats died because they believed an invitation to negotiate was genuine. That is not a minor operational footnote. That is a catastrophic breach of the foundational trust on which all mediation depends. And then it happened again. February 28th. An Iranian delegation in Oman, signatures being prepared, peace framework hours from completion. The next morning, the bombs fell. Qatar was not just watching from the outside. They were inside the architecture. They knew what the timeline looked like. They knew what had been promised, and they watched it get used as cover for a military operation that was already locked and loaded before the first handshake. The arrogance of the old playbook assumed that even betrayed partners have no real choice but to stay. Qatar just proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. The board has changed. The pieces are no longer passive. And Washington is still moving as though it is playing the game from 20 years ago. That miscalculation has a cost. And we're about to see exactly what that cost looks like. This is the part of the story that the headline coverage gets completely, fundamentally wrong. Every major outlet is treating Qatar's withdrawal as a symbolic loss, a reputational setback for Washington, an embarrassing diplomatic moment that will require some careful messaging to manage. They are describing the departure of a mediator as though it is roughly equivalent to losing a seat on a committee. That framing is not just incomplete. It is dangerously misleading. Qatar was not a mediator in the conventional sense. Qatar was the infrastructure itself. Remove Qatar, and you are not simply losing a neutral party who is helping two sides communicate. You are destroying the entire operational architecture through which de-escalation was even theoretically possible. Let me be precise about what that means in practice. Function 1. Qatar served as what analysts would call a real-time diplomatic signal arbitrage mechanism. When Tehran needed to communicate a red line to Washington without the provocation of direct contact, the message went through Doha. When Washington needed to test Iranian reactions to specific proposals without triggering a formal response that would lock both sides into positions, it used the Qatari channel. This is not symbolic communication. This is the difference between two nuclear-capable adversaries having a managed disagreement and having no mechanism to prevent miscalculation from becoming catastrophe. Function 2. Qatar was the early warning system. Before a military action crossed a threshold that would force a mandatory response, Qatari officials could signal quietly, deniably, immediately that a line was approaching. That function is gone. There is now no buffer between action and reaction. No whisper network operating in real time. Just silence, and then whatever comes after the silence. Function 3. Qatar provided what negotiators call the credibility buffer. Both sides could explore compromise positions that would look like weakness to their domestic audiences if made publicly precisely because the Qatari channel allowed those explorations to remain invisible. Without that buffer, neither side can afford to appear to be searching for an exit. The political cost of being seen to negotiate becomes prohibitive. And when the cost of talking exceeds the cost of fighting, you already know which direction things move. Nothing replaces these three functions. Not the European Union, which was already structurally marginalized before Qatar's exit. Not the United Nations, which operates on timelines measured in months, while this conflict moves in hours. Not Oman, which is watching what happened to Qatar and running a very rational calculation about whether it wants to inherit that role. The diplomatic space in this conflict has not narrowed. It has collapsed. Completely. And the collapse was not inevitable. It was engineered, unintentionally perhaps, but engineered nonetheless, by a series of decisions that prioritized short-term tactical gains over the long-term architecture of conflict management. Now let us talk about what comes next. Because the response to Qatar's withdrawal is not going to look like anything Washington's strategic models are currently pricing in. Announcement number 1. The Strait of Hormuz is now the most consequential geographic bottleneck on the planet. Approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes through a waterway that is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Iran does not need to physically close the strait to achieve its strategic objective. It needs only to make closure appear sufficiently credible. Lloyd's of London and the broader maritime insurance market have already begun recalibrating war risk premiums for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf. When those premiums reach the level where commercial operators begin voluntarily rerouting or suspending transits, you have achieved a functional blockade without firing a single additional shot. The economic transmission mechanism is already in motion. Every basis point increase in maritime insurance costs flows directly into global freight rates, which flow into consumer prices, which flow into the inflation calculations of every central bank on Earth. This is not a regional economic event. This is a global supply chain stress test being conducted in real time. Announcement number 2. The petrodollar architecture, the foundational agreement through which Gulf states price oil in United States dollars. Recycling those dollars into American Treasury bonds and maintaining Washington's ability to run structural deficits without triggering a currency crisis is under quiet but accelerating pressure. This is not a new observation, but the political conditions that previously made any deviation from dollar pricing unthinkable for Gulf states are changing rapidly. When Qatar, a state that hosts the largest American military base in the Middle East, concludes that its association with Washington has become a strategic liability rather than a strategic asset, other Gulf states are performing the same calculation. A partial, incremental shift in pricing mechanisms for certain bilateral energy transactions does not require a dramatic announcement. It happens quietly through bilateral agreements denominated in alternative currencies for specific contract structures. And when it reaches sufficient scale, it does not look like a market event. It looks like a system event. Announcement number 3. The legal architecture of this conflict is about to become a battlefield in itself. Qatar's withdrawal provides Iran and its legal teams with a factual foundation for an extraordinarily damaging argument before international legal bodies, including the International Court of Justice. The argument is not complicated. 2 separate diplomatic processes, both facilitated by recognized neutral parties, were terminated by military strikes launched while those processes were actively ongoing. If that pattern can be established as a matter of documented record, and Qatar's formal withdrawal statement contributes significantly to that record, the legal exposure for future military operations becomes substantially more complex. Not because international law has enforcement mechanisms that can stop the strike, but because the reputational and coalition costs of being formally adjudicated as a state that uses negotiation as a targeting mechanism are costs that accumulate over time and constrain future options in ways that are extremely difficult to reverse. 3 choke points. None of them require a single additional missile. All of them are already in motion. Washington is preparing for the war it knows how to fight. The response being prepared is the war Washington does not know how to fight. Let me bring in a perspective that should give everyone watching this serious pause. Henry Kissinger spent 50 years studying the relationship between power and diplomacy. He was not an idealist. He was not a moralist. He was the coldest, most calculating strategic mind American foreign policy ever produced. And the principle he returned to repeatedly across every conflict he analyzed was this: the moment you destroy the communication channel, you lose the ability to manage the escalation. Not influence it, not shape it, manage it. You lose the ability to prevent a miscalculation from becoming irreversible. Washington appears to have forgotten that lesson entirely. Now look at where the sophisticated money is moving. Because financial markets are not sentimental. They do not have political preferences. They price reality. Quantitative hedge funds running systematic commodity models have been quietly accumulating long positions in Brent crude futures at durations that extend well beyond any normal geopolitical risk premium horizon. This is not short-term speculation on a news cycle. This is institutional capital making a structural bet on a prolonged disruption scenario. Lloyd's of London, the institution that has priced maritime risk for 3 centuries and has seen every version of this story, has moved war risk premiums for Persian Gulf vessel transits to levels not recorded since the tanker wars of 1988. When the oldest risk assessment institution in the world reprices at that magnitude, it is not reacting to headlines. It is responding to intelligence that does not make the evening news. And then there is Beijing and Moscow. China has accelerated Iranian crude imports through what shipping analysts are now openly calling a shadow fleet operating outside conventional tracking systems. Russia has repositioned naval assets in the eastern Mediterranean in ways that serve no obvious defensive purpose. Both governments are behaving as though the next phase of this conflict is not a possibility they are preparing for. It is a timeline they are already working around. When the smart money, the oldest risk institutions, and 2 permanent Security Council members are all moving in the same direction simultaneously, that is not coincidence. That is signal. We are now at the part of the analysis that matters most. Not what has happened. What happens next? I am going to give you 3 specific scenarios. Each one is grounded in the current architecture of the conflict as it actually exists today, not as Washington is describing it, not as the mainstream coverage is framing it, but as the underlying strategic dynamics suggest it is likely to develop. These are not predictions. They are probability-weighted frameworks based on the pattern of decisions and the structure of incentives that are currently visible to anyone looking carefully enough. Scenario 1. The managed collapse. Estimated probability, 35%. Washington quietly acknowledges, through back channels rather than public statements, that the loss of Qatar represents a functional collapse of the diplomatic architecture. A replacement mediator is identified. Turkey is the most frequently mentioned candidate. Ankara has the relationships, the geographic positioning, and the political incentive to step into the vacuum. Possibly India, which has maintained carefully calibrated relationships with both Washington and Tehran and has enormous economic exposure to a prolonged Gulf disruption. The replacement process takes weeks, possibly months. During that window, the conflict continues without any meaningful off-ramp mechanism. Eventually, a framework emerges. A ceasefire is announced. Both sides claim strategic victory for their domestic audiences. But what results is not peace. What results is a frozen conflict. A Korean peninsula model transplanted into the Persian Gulf. Hostilities suspended but not resolved. Grievances intact. Underlying dynamics unchanged. The region lives under a permanent low-grade tension that periodically threatens to reignite. The long-term cost of this scenario is measured not in immediate casualties, but in a decade of degraded American diplomatic credibility across the entire Middle East. Every future negotiation carries the shadow of what happened in Doha and Oman. Every future invitation to dialogue is received with a calculation that was not necessary before this conflict began. Scenario 2. The spiral. Estimated probability, 40%. This is the scenario that the removal of Qatar makes most structurally likely, and the one that receives the least serious analytical attention in mainstream coverage. Without a functioning mediation channel, without an early warning system, without a credibility buffer, the conflict is now operating without any mechanism to prevent a miscalculation from becoming catastrophic. One incident. One drone that crosses a threshold by accident. One naval confrontation in contested waters that neither side intended to escalate, but neither side can afford to back down from publicly. The spiral does not require malicious intent. It only requires the absence of the architecture that previously made de-escalation possible. Iran moves to restrict commercial transit through the Strait of Hormuz, not a full closure. A partial, deniable restriction achieved through maritime insurance collapse and credible threat posture. Oil moves toward $150 per barrel, possibly beyond. The inflationary transmission is immediate and global. European economies, already structurally fragile, enter recession within 2 quarters. Emerging market economies with dollar-denominated debt face a simultaneous currency crisis and commodity shock. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice between inflation control and economic stabilization. Saudi Arabia, which entered this scenario as Washington's last remaining Arab partner, discovers that MBS has miscalculated his own exposure. The war he was encouraging from a position of apparent safety arrives at his borders in ways he did not adequately model. This scenario does not end with a negotiated settlement. It ends with exhaustion. And exhaustion at this scale of destruction produces settlements that nobody would have voluntarily agreed to at the beginning, which is precisely why the beginning was the moment to pursue the diplomacy that was instead used as a targeting mechanism. Scenario 3. The Grand Bargain. Estimated probability, 25%. This is the scenario that almost nobody in Western media is discussing seriously, which is, in my assessment, precisely why it deserves the most careful attention. China steps into the vacuum that Qatar has left, not reluctantly, not as a mediator of last resort, but as a strategic actor that has been quietly positioning for exactly this moment for several years. Beijing's offer is structurally elegant. China provides Iran with credible security guarantees and integration into a broader regional economic architecture, the kind of arrangement that renders American sanctions substantially less effective. In exchange, Iran accepts verifiable constraints on its nuclear program sufficient to satisfy the minimum requirements of regional stability. Saudi Arabia, calculating that a Chinese-brokered stability is preferable to a continued American-led conflict that is now threatening its own economic foundations, quietly signals acceptance. The result is not a Middle East that is hostile to the United States. It is something more strategically damaging. A Middle East that is simply no longer organized around American primacy. A region where Washington is not defeated. Where Washington is not expelled. Where Washington is just no longer necessary. Not removed from the table. No longer invited to it. Of the three scenarios, this is the one being most actively discussed in the corridors that do not appear on your evening news. And it is the one that, if it materializes, will represent the most consequential geopolitical realignment since the fall of the Soviet Union. The question is not whether one of these three paths will be taken. The question is which one the next 72 hours makes most likely. There is a principle that every serious student of geopolitical history eventually arrives at. Power is not measured by how many weapons you possess. Power is measured by who controls the conditions of the next conversation. Qatar just removed that control from Washington's hands entirely. You cannot bomb your way to a negotiating table that no longer exists. You cannot project diplomatic power through a channel you yourself destroyed. The person who needs the deal less always wins. Right now, Washington needs the deal most and has the fewest people willing to help them get it. Which of the three scenarios do you believe plays out first? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe, because the next move is coming faster than anyone expects.